All right, recording is on. Go for it.
Hi, gang, and welcome to the SIG Cloud Provider meeting on February 6th, 2019. We will start with any introductions of new folks joining this meeting for the first time. If you would like to introduce yourself and just let us know where you come from, that'll let us know who's speaking up. Any new folks? Sounds like no. Moving on to the agenda. The first topic is from Andrew and Nishi, talking about consolidating the provider SIGs. You guys want to take that away?
Yeah, so I can kick this one off. In the first SIG meeting of 2019, we were kind of picking up discussions from KubeCon around how we want governance model to look like for the provider SIGs. And so we had kind of just left it as like, let's write a proposal, let's see what ideas we can get, talk to some folks in steering. And so there's some ideas circulating around right now. And so most of the ideas are in the proposal. I think we're still a pretty long way off in terms of like, I feel like there's a lot of alternatives and a lot of things we're not considering as part of this migration. But Nishi had some ideas and she had added a bunch of stuff to the proposal. Nishi, do you want to kind of talk a bit about some of the ideas you put in there?
Yeah, sure. So I did take Andrew, I believe Caleb and Jago's initial proposal, and I cleaned it up with some logic around why we think technically it would make better sense for the core code base in terms of stability and also standardizing a way in which out-of-tree features are released, just for the ecosystem to be more stable. So I just reworded some of the logic there as to why we think this would be useful. And then we are basically proposing cloud providers as sub-projects to SIG Cloud Provider. And the idea is to collapse some of the organization issues. So the idea is to allow the SIGs to operate as user groups where they can continue to meet via Zoom on a bi-weekly basis and solve user issues. But in terms of how the out-of-tree features are released or other things in terms of quarterly community updates or GitHub labels and notifications, there are some suggestions in terms of organizing these sub-projects better. Also, if you think about sigs.yaml where all the projects are listed today, there's a way whereby the sub-projects are under SIG AWS or SIG IBM or SIG VMware. And the proposal here is probably we just prefix the sub-projects with the provider name and then list all of them under SIG Cloud Provider, just to make the organization of this proposal simple and not build any new systems or sub-projects under each of the providers. So it's just a proposal, and I think it might work fine in terms of what we are trying to achieve, but obviously it requires inputs from all the SIG leads and discussion. We've also added a table that talks about, do you agree with the overall idea? And if you could just put in your inputs, give your feedback, and then say yes or no, then we can make some progress. Even if it's a no, at least we need to know what is bothering people. And right now we don't feel like we're getting that information. Hence, this is a stab at that to achieve that goal.
I feel like
what form do you want this poll in? Like comments in this doc or verbally here in this meeting or some third thing?
Comments in the doc is fine, and if you want, you'll need some time to read through this and internalize it, or If you're willing to give comments right now, that's fine too. But the doc would be a good starting point. And then we can take it out and have an open discussion about it.
Okay, I'll pass on comments now and wait till I read it. But
Okay.
But yeah, you raise a good point though. Like we don't have, I feel like in this meeting at least, we don't have all the stakeholders in place to actually make a decision on anything. So I feel like we need to either go to all the provider SIG biweekly meetings and bring it up there, or something else.
I think on that topic, Andrea, I think maybe just an email to the SIG leads of the relevant SIG is maybe a way to have a discussion in a non-threatening way, showing up to their SIG meeting, if they should exist, and maybe not. But
that's a good point.
But
yeah,
what value they get out of it, and if the proposal we have addresses those needs. It's a bit of a not to be in, because we're trying to like channel the request from the steering committee to dedupe and reduce the number of SIGs and avoid 80 more provider SIGs. But we don't quite understand what value folks are getting out of it. So Andrew and Nishi, is that something you're willing to reach out to those? It's a pretty short list, so we can split it up, or you guys can send the same email to the 9 people I think we're talking about.
Yep. That sounds good. Yeah.
I guess with the mailing list, I was a bit worried about like bike shedding happening on a single thread. So, which is why we had the proposal out, just so we can like hash out all the details ahead of time. I think you're mute, or I can't hear you if you're talking.
Thing to directly email the SIG leads for AWS, GCP, VMware, whatever the ones that are listed.
Okay.
And just ask what value they get out of it. It's not a public, even leading question that maybe that SIG doesn't need to exist. It's just a question, you know, what do you get out of it? What benefits do we need to replicate? And then we could have a sub-project of type user group or something. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we get Dan Kahn to say, yes, those sub-projects can have time at KubeCon.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest selling points for people is, you know, everybody who has a SIG right now has enjoyed a lot of benefits. And I know that we would be unhappy losing those benefits. So, you know, where we can preserve those, you know, while reducing the SIG load, I think is valuable and important.
Okay, so talk to all the SIG leads, try to figure out what works, see what we're missing and what else we need to do to make this work going forward, and then try to formalize something after that.
Right, and at some point, I think it's actually pretty important to publish this. And I'm not even sure if the cloud provider mailing list is the appropriate place, but maybe the larger Kubernetes mailing list. You know, we can't expect everybody who has a stake in this to be attending these meetings or for us to drop in on their meetings. And so, you know, at some point, once a plan is closer to being implemented, I wouldn't necessarily call it bike shedding to get community feedback, you know, by and large, you know, before making a large change like this, because it will impact not just the SIG owners and the SIG leads, but, you know, it's going to have an effect on the people who are participating in those and on the, you know, it's going to trickle down to the users who are depending upon those platforms.
Yeah, the stakeholders who are represented just mailing SIG leads are the users. And I know in the VMware SIG, we are starting to build traction where those guys rarely appeared at first, but I think in the last meetings, we've consistently had users showing up. And I do know that there's a community of those who look at the videos and don't show up at the meetings too, just because of time zone issues. And
yeah,
we're seeing the same thing of this traction building in our Slack channel too.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of the CNCF, it is critical to maintain direct contact with those end users for the CNCF to continue to grow and expand and maintain a relevant relationship with their users. So I think if we can aggregate into a clear and consistent ask of CNCF at KubeCons for Slack channels and whatever those mechanisms are that people depend on and use to communicate with their end users, I'm almost certain the CNCF would be happy to accommodate, and maybe we could come out with even better benefits for user groups than for provider-specific SIGs.
Right. Right. And there are things that are, models that we can also look at too, like, SIG user experience. Is user experience or Paris
developer contributor
experience. Yeah. Maybe some of these efforts, instead of being a part of the larger KubeCon, become, more something that's part of an expanded developer experience, because really, this is one of the big areas where we're trying to reach out and bring people in is, if Kubernetes is a kernel that provides a place to plug in different functionality, the providers are going to be bringing a lot of that functionality, and having a sanctioned developer venue for them to participate, I think is fairly important, and actually is very powerful in building community.
I think we should capture that. So your focus is on the contributor side. Mine is on the end user side, and the direct interaction with folks who are trying to run their own workloads on some provider and just want somewhere to go and ask for guidance. So I think both of those are valid, but it suggests that there's probably more than the ones we think of right here.
Right.
Yeah, and they're not black and white. We just had a user show up at the VMware SIG asking how to get involved writing code. So it happens.
Yeah, and there's, there are things like, like right now at KubeCon we have, SIGs are given an intro and a deep dive, and I don't know what everyone else's experiences are from this, but from the OpenStack side, we've typically treated the intro as how do you get started using it as a consumer, and we want that to be more user-faced, and we try to make the deep dive, how do you get involved as a developer, and how do you contribute and become part of this. And so to me, there's already like a natural way to divide those two user sets that, is kind of being addressed by the current structure in place.
And don't forget that DX.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
And so I also wanted to bring up another perspective. So I opened a recent issue that's related to out-of-tree feature releases. So in SIG AWS, we always use the update session in KubeCon to talk about the new sub-projects we've added. And then we move them through alpha, beta, and GA cycle, just like the in-tree features. We want to follow that release cadence, but then it's becoming cumbersome for anybody, for the SIG release team primarily, that's focused on in-tree features, to start focusing on out-of-tree features as well. So in some ways, the SIG providers need a release cycle. They also need to follow a testing cadence and a documentation cadence, which is sort of a in-tree best practice. And then it also relates to the KubeCon sessions that are done for the users who show up. Plus, if you look through the documentation that we've done, we are also suggesting that none of the Slack channels, none of the Zoom sessions, the biweekly sessions need to be collapsed. They can continue as usual. But for the benefit of the project, and because this is the largest out-of-tree umbrella, out-of-tree feature umbrella, it can be consolidated, and there can be a nice structure that can form around it, and it'll help the Kubernetes ecosystem. So this is also an issue, if you could comment on it and add your thoughts, because each one of you is working on different infrastructure components that ultimately will link to Kubernetes APIs, and you will maintain the cadence of those sub-projects, then the release aspect of things also becomes important, and we can't mingle the out-of-tree and in-tree feature releases, which causes confusions for everyone. Hopefully that makes sense. I just wanted to add some context there.
Yeah, that's great, Nishi. Thank you for raising that. I had missed that in the never-ending swamp of issues and notifications. I pulled it out in the agenda so that folks don't miss it. I think it's important in its own right and not as part of the collapsing cloud providers.
There's one thing I was thinking the other day about, as they are today, folding makes sense because of the, if we look at the status quo, we see that it's pretty much people are working just on providing the basic infrastructure services to run Kubernetes on the platform. But if we look at the ecosystem for Kubernetes, I think we're going to see, as Kubernetes get adopted and we get, to more people using the software on more traditional shops, trying to do more integration, new companies coming up, trying to do more integration for specific platforms or with their own software on a specific platform. I think, the venue for developers to reach out to people working on a specific platform with that knowledge of that platform, being AWS, Azure, VMware, or whatever, it's going to be very important. If we take that away, like from not necessarily just a weekly meeting, but the entire structure that brings the SIG with it. So the sessions, the meeting points, even just the technical leads and a couple of SIG chairs that are the point of contact for that specific platform. I still think we should find a way, and probably, Jega, you mentioned talking with Chris from CNCF, see if there's a way to get to a point where we expand not just SIG, maybe just call it a different way, but a way to have a user group or a developer group for a specific platform would make more sense than just folding everything under a single umbrella and just keep the status quo, basically.
Yeah, I think those are good points, and I think we have a general sense of what the benefits are, but I just want to make sure we actually ask people instead of going with the assumptions and what we can dream up. So I think that will help close the loop, and then we can come up with a concrete proposal and get backing from the CNCF for our proposal and take that back to the SIGs, because I think the burden is on us to make sure we meet the needs and make it better. Otherwise, we've seen it just stalls out and doesn't make progress.
Cool. Sounds good.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest we move on. And the next one, Andrew, you're up again.
Yep. So actually the next 3 items are all mine, so I'll try to blaze through them fast. So the first one is ignoring nodes in the Cloud Controller Manager. So there was a use case that came out where someone is running the virtual kubelet on a cluster that runs the Cloud Controller Manager, and the Cloud Controller Manager is deleting the node because the virtual kubelet doesn't send heartbeats and updates its status. And so there was a proposal there's a PR open that introduces an annotation. And if you explicitly set that annotation on a node, so for this instance, on the virtual kubelet, then the Cloud Controller Manager will skip registering it and deleting it. And so I wanted to go for it.
Yeah, my immediate reaction is having felt pain in the annotation to field promotions in, I can't remember, 1.7 to 1.8, maybe, I can't remember what it was. The annotations become part of the API, and my question to push on this a bit harder is, is there a way to make it a field somewhere that won't change and isn't swappable?
Yeah, so that was kind of following up on, on the second point there, Jordan had mentioned maybe as part of a longer term solution, we may want to give every Cloud Controller Manager an ID and every node an ID, so that we're correlating this set of CCMs should always register these set of nodes. And we can embed that into the node API and actually make it a legitimate field. But obviously that's going to require writing a CAP and doing more work. But I feel do we want to take a shortcut and add the annotation for the virtual kubelet case, or do we want to just full stop, close this PR and think more long term and implement something that's going to satisfy more requirements going forward? I guess that's kind of the question I wanted to ask. It seems Diego, your opinion is to do it right, start with the field, don't take shortcuts with annotations.
Yeah, I think I've given away my through my nonverbal communication. I just find every time we take the shortcut or do something for now becomes forever.
Yeah.
And then when we change those APIs, we end up breaking people during upgrades. And this erodes the trust of the upgrade process. So it's not, I'm almost sure we could get something to work in practice, but it's not the steady state that is the problem with any of these annotations with a growth path. It's the maintenance over time. It's day one, day two, and these are the problems that customers actually have, and that we have managing, many of them. That is my opinion. Others have thoughts. What do you think about that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that sounds pretty good and reasonable.
Okay.
It's true though. Like we're stuck with, like, even with load balancers, like we have a bunch of these like alpha, beta field annotations that are just stuck there and no one touches them because it would break a lot of stuff if we did. So makes sense.
Or even worse, like maybe it wouldn't break anything, but nobody knows, right?
Yeah. So it seems like we need to probably talk to SIG node too for this and see what changes you want to make to nodes to make this happen. Okay, that sounds good to me.
Cool.
By the way, one more question, Andrew.
Yeah.
Virtual kubelet is not necessarily, how should I say it, the most important integration path to a serverless, or is the preferred path to a serverless integration for every provider, as far as I know. And since we're actually taking the Cloud Controller Manager out of Tree, for this specific use case, you could also ask the provider that's using virtual kubelet to add a controller specifically for that. In which case, it can talk to the VK node. And if there is a scenario where they extend the VK nodes with multiple backend plugins to the serverless infrastructure, then they get to manage that controller.
Right. So like temporary workaround could be to custom build controller. Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe this is a naive question, but it sounds like part of the challenge is that the virtual kubelet isn't behaving like a kubelet. So
yeah, and it won't. It has a lot of limitations. In fact, it doesn't support all the controller side API features as well.
But a heartbeat and health endpoint seem reasonable to be part of a virtual kubelet, even if it's just emulating the behavior, right? I don't know. Again, maybe it's
it's just that the interface is, the interface today doesn't have a heartbeat implementation.
Yeah.
But also because we don't know how the backend, it's different for Fargate for ACI. We don't know what is the best manner to integrate this provider specific feature. And I just believe that because not every provider has an integration with serverless infrastructure, they should figure out how they want to do it.
Right. Okay. So what I'm getting at is like, it doesn't seem like the use case is common enough for us to build anything in the core tree for this. So temporary workarounds can happen using like custom controllers, but to kind of like address use cases like this in a more general context, we should see what we can do to V1 node and add something in an actual API. Okay, sounds good to me. So the next item, cloud provider end-to-end test. So I added the first cloud provider end-to-end test as part of like that testing framework we wanted to do for cloud providers. So I created an issue that kind of lists out some of the other end-to-end tests that we need to do. So I think this needs a little bit more grooming. I need to go through all the end-to-end tests we have and see like which ones we actually should cover. I know there's a lot of like GKE specific ones that are embedded in there somewhere. But I think it'd be great if we can generalize them a bit more so we can run them on more providers, and then providers can like kind of run this test suite when they start moving from like in tree to out of tree, so they can have a little bit more confidence going forward. So this issue needs some help. So if you're interested in contributing or you want to take any of these up, I think this is a pretty good starting issue. And you can use the first node deletion test case as kind of an example.
Well done, Andrew. This is awesome.
Thanks. All right, so next one, just wanted to give a quick status update on the provider extraction work that Nishi, Mike, and Walter and I are working on. So phase one, we're still on phase one, which is to stage all the cloud providers. That way we can publish them out to out-of-tree providers if they want to. And this kind of gives us that like seamless migration between in-tree and out-of-tree. The blocker for staging a repository is to remove the in-tree dependencies. So like the provider packages can't import anything, can't import in-tree package, otherwise we can't export it into an external repo. So we're going through all the dependencies, breaking them out. We're about 70% done, and I'm hoping that by 1.14 we'll have all the dependencies out, and it'd be great if we can stage it before 1.14. Most likely I think we'll have the dependencies removed, but we won't get to the staging part. But we'll see how that goes. That's it for me.
Anybody have questions on that part or ability to pitch in for this push?
We have a weekly sub-project meeting for the extraction work every Thursdays at 4:30 Eastern time if you're interested in joining.
Okay, that is the end of our scheduled content. Anybody have last minute thoughts they'd like to add that they forgot to add to the agenda? Going once, going twice, sold. All right, thank you everybody. Catch up, take half an hour back and we'll see you online.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye, folks.